Okay, I think that we may start. I see that a lot of people are already in. So welcome everyone. And thank you for coming to this session of the Dialogue in European Jain Studies series. I am joined today by my colleagues Tine Weckmans from Ghent University and Chris Miller from the Arihanta Institute. So we have collaborated to develop this speaker series to present the state of the art of research in Jainism and Jain studies in Europe. And we are really pleased that you came tonight for this event on eating and on fasting from a contemporary and historical perspective. Before we start, let me briefly show you how to register to future events. So let me see if I can share my screen with you all. So in our main website, of the Dialogue in European Jain Study on the Arihanta Institute website, you see that there is a See Future Event tab. You just click on it, and when you do, normally you have this small icon register now that I just invite you to follow, and you will be registered. And you can see that next month there is a panel on teaching and learning Jainism today. I will hand it over to my colleague Chris Miller, who is going to tell us a little bit about the topic.
Thank you, Marie-Elaine. Jajanendra, welcome everyone. It's my honor to welcome you today as we delve into the compelling realm of studying food and fasting in the Jain tradition. As we begin this Dialogues in European Jain Studies event, I would just like to briefly highlight at least 3 reasons regarding why the study of Jain dietary and fasting practices can be compelling and important in the field of Jain studies and beyond. So first, anthropologically, the examination of Jain food and fasting practices opens a doorway into the intricate fabric of human culture. By exploring Jain foodways, we gain valuable insights into how these practices shape social dynamics and contribute to the cultural identity of Jain communities in both the past and the present. Second, philosophically, Jainism offers profound teachings on nonviolence, compassion, and spiritual purification and karma. The meticulous adherence to vegetarianism and increasingly veganism, both characteristic of Jain dietary practices, indeed reflects a commitment to non-harming and prompts us to ponder ethical choices in our contemporary, very interconnected world. Additionally, fasting itself in Jainism is not merely abstaining from food. It serves as a powerful tool for self-discipline and spiritual elevation and other things that we will learn about today. Philosophical inquiries into the nature of desire, discipline, and the pursuit of liberation find indeed a unique expression in the fasting and dietary traditions of the Jain tradition. And third, practically speaking, the study of Jain food and fasting has implications for our health, our well-being, aligning with global interests in mindful eating and intermittent fasting, for example, as is popularly talked about all the time in the community, but also, as we'll see today, food security, for example. Moreover, the exploration of Jain dietary practices extends beyond religious observance, offering a nuanced understanding of how traditions adapt to contemporary challenges and influences, thus contributing to broader discussions on cultural resilience and change. So as we now begin this dialogue surrounding the study of food and fasting in the Jain tradition, let us explore the anthropological, the historical, the philosophical, the practical, and many other dimensions that make this topic not only intellectually engaging, but also relevant to our understanding of this intricate interplay between tradition, culture, human experience, global issues, and whatnot. Thank you, and I look forward to the insightful discussions that will unfold today in this dialogue, and I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Tine Weckmans at Ghent University, who will introduce our esteemed MC and presider for this event. Thanks, Tine.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, indeed, we are once again super excited about our entire lineup, but especially also about our MC for tonight, Professor Atul Shah, professor at the University of London, who holds a PhD from the London School of Economics. His work as a scholar, but also as a broadcaster, has been on celebrating diversity and fostering cultural intelligence, as he himself puts it, in both societal and professional contexts. As an extension of that, he also theorizes and puts into practice the significance of Jain ethics in the world today, in business, in banking, in several fields. As such, he's published widely, including books such as Jainism and Ethical Finance, which is a lovely and highly recommended book published in 2017, I think, and more recently, Inclusive and Sustainable Finance. He regularly provides context and expertise to British media outlets such as BBC and Channel 4. If you can find a recording or catch a glimpse of his Masala tour of Britain, I highly recommend it. On a personal note, I know Atul as an incredibly driven networker and, as he says himself, a hyper-connected person. You should ask him afterwards where he is presenting from today. And a very generous guide to myself, and I assume many others, looking into Jainism, applied Jainism, Jainism outside of South Asia. My own research would not be the same without him at all. So this is why we are so excited to have him tonight as an MC, and I will hand over to you, Atul, to introduce our first speaker. Thank you very much for being here, JG.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tina. And thanks to all of you, the audience. We have clearly a global audience today. Melanie Barbato is all the way speaking from Fiji, and she's a researcher at the University of Münster, at the moment in Fiji. Melanie is the author of Jain Approaches to Plurality, published by Brill in the series Currents of Encounter. She holds a doctorate in Indology and Religious Studies from LMU Munich and a master's degree in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford. She currently pursues a habilitation at the University of Münster, and Melanie was part of the Food and the Sacred group of the Food Security Project at the Centre of Religion, Human Values and International Relations at Dublin City University. She coordinates together with Shruti Dixit the network of Hinduism in Dialogue, which is based at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, and is associate editor of Cross Currents. So over to you, Melanie.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I will start by sharing my presentation. So hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today on this panel about food and fasting in Jainism. I want to explore with you what Jainism might have to say on a specific practical topic, that is food security. Food security refers to a situation in which every person is able to receive at all times a sufficient amount of safe and nutritious food. Food security can be threatened by many things. In recent years, we have seen the disruption of logistics and supply channels during COVID-19. Also, the risk of hunger in countries that depend on grain from Ukraine after the attack by Russia. And more long-term, we know that climate change and limited resources mean that global food systems are vulnerable, and we need to rethink what human diet should look like in the future. As everyone knows who has worked in Jain studies or interacted extensively with Jain in other contexts, food is a very important aspect of the identity of most Jains. Jainism has a very long tradition of weighing good and not so good food choices. And the question that interests me is what a religious tradition that has thought so much about food could bring to the discussions about food security. My presentation has two parts. The first part is specific to Jainism in terms how Jain thought and practice connects to issues of food security. The second part discusses more generally the role or possible role of religious actors in discussions about food security. I will provide a number of reasons why actors in food security should listen to religious communities like the Jain community and integrate them into policy consultation and decision-making processes. So it's very much a contemporary and applied approach to the topic and what could be called engaged scholarship. The question, what should we eat, is in Jainism connected closely to the concept of ahimsa or non-violence. It is best to eat in such a way that the least violence is caused. violence can be defined quite broadly as any form of negative impact on other living beings. So there are certain food groups that are excluded from the menu because they cause more harm than others, meat eating being the most obvious, but also, for example, eggs or root vegetables. And there are also rankings of the harvest methods. Like if you want to eat an apple, it's worse to fell the tree than to cut the branch. It's worse to cut the branch than to break the twig. Worse to break the twig than to just take an apple that was ripe and has fallen to the ground. So very basically, both the type of food that is consumed and the methods of growing, carving, and distribution matter to Jainism, and they also matter to discussions about food security. Also, the standard Jain dietary regulations, they are rational within their frame of thinking because they are about quantifiable rankings of harm. The concrete ways of how the place in that ranking is determined might not always be transferable to other systems like contemporary biology, but in principle, these considerations are all rational within their traditional science. And this is very different from the dietary regulations that we find in some other religious traditions that declare certain forms of food as clean or unclean, such as you're allowed to eat that type of meat, but not that one, without much further explanations, and maybe mainly as a means of demarcation or to practice spiritual discipline. In Jainism, we find a multidimensional approach to food that can connect quite easily to discussions about food security and to search for a sustainable diet for the future. And indeed, Jains are at the forefront of religious groups that seek to motivate people towards dietary transition, away from meat consumption, towards a more sustainable vegetarian or vegan diet. This means that some Jains seek to extend the rational principles behind the Jain dietary regulations to the contemporary settings of factory farming, climate change, and so on. And some Jains reach the conclusion that a contemporary Jain take based on the traditional principles should be vegan if we want to have an ethical and sustainable diet for today. For example, the book An Ahimsa Crisis, You Decide by Sulekshti Jain, which was published in 2016, makes the case for extending ahimsa-based dietary self-regulation beyond traditional requirements to a vegan lifestyle, with reference to animal rights, but also environmental issues and the climate-affecting methane produced by cows. Tusha Mehta from Plant-Based Data has in 2022 at a panel discussion on applied Jain ethics for Earth Day, pointed to the Jain principle of the interconnectedness and interdependence of all souls with explicit reference to food security. So he argued that while many see human and non-human relations as separate, a Jain perspective will acknowledge how human injustice leads to eco-injustice, but also how eco-injustice leads to human injustice, because the poor are always the ones that are affected most by ecological degradation. So for example, exploitative animal agriculture impacts on the environment, which affects the poor the most, both directly, but also indirectly by the impact of food security that stems from these exploitative agricultural methods. The connection between Jainism and food security is, however, not always as clear-cut. A while ago, a Jain told me when I spoke about my interest in Jain food, Jainism is not a food religion. And I would agree, Jainism is ultimately not about food security, but about soul security. So the violence of food production and consumption is considered of harm to the soul, and it is given so much consideration because Jainism is a path for cleansing the soul. This can be seen very well in the prescriptions for Jain renouncers, for example, in the Acharanga Sutra. So here the practice of salekana, fasting to death, is described. For example, he should lie down without food. When affected by pain in that situation, he should bear it. He should not transgress, even when he has been affected by something that other people do. And animals who crawl or live above or below may feed on his flesh and blood, but he does not hurt them, nor does he rub them away. So the renouncer should just lie down and not even mind birds or creatures from the earth or underground to feed on him. That is a reversal from the usual causing harm by taking food. And that's a move towards the ultimate non-attachment of being oneself used by other life forms as food. Giving up food and fasting to death is in a way a natural consequence if avoiding harm from food consumption is taken to its logical end. In other words, if producing and consuming food is so producing violence, the highest form of detachment is letting go of even the basic life-sustaining food consumption. Now, how do we resolve this tension between food security and soul security? One way is to look, I think, at actual Jain practice. Salekana is a practice for the religious virtuoso and only permissible under certain circumstances, while everyday life in the Jain community is characterized by a social interplay of eating and fasting. A common prejudice against religion is that religion is just about the afterlife, about giving people the illusion of hope for the future so that they can put up with suffering in the here and now. But this is not how religious communities actually work. Food and fasting, the householder and the renouncement Jainism, they are in many ways interconnected, for example, through almsgiving and alms receiving. So that working towards food security and soul security, they actually support each other when you look at Jainism. What religious communities do actually is to ground calls for food security in a wider horizon of meaning, for the meaning of life. And this is something that technocratic systems or the big agency actually often struggle with. This is why religious groups are often particularly suited to motivate people towards action where there is no immediate return on investment. And this is a massive issue in food security, where much of the task is actually to motivate people towards redistribution and sharing with the poor, but also with future generations on this planet. I would like to give 2 examples from a recent book, Food Charity in India. The first is a chapter that connects Ahadhan, the traditional gifting of food to ascetics or the needy, with contemporary practice. For example, the Jain International Trade Organization in Bangalore distributed in their city 46,000 packed meals to the needy and another 24,000 packed to the stranded migrant workers every day from March 29 to May 3, 2020. The organization set up a kitchen managed by over 200 people to prepare and distribute sattvic, quality, and hygienic Jain food. And according to the authors, this was the largest voluntary initiative during the COVID-19 crisis in India, involving more than 500 volunteers. And over 1 million meals were distributed that way. Similar initiatives were started by Jain elsewhere in India and abroad. So the question is, how were Jains, as well as some other communities, such as the Sikhs, able to step up so quickly? I would say it's a long tradition of effective volunteering and providing meals for large numbers of pilgrims. So a case study in the same book describes the everyday food preparations at Hombuja or Hombuja, home of a Jain monk and the well-known Padmavati temple. According to that case study, the number of devotees served during normal days is 500 to 1,000 people. The food is first offered and then served to the devotees. And during festival days, the number of devotees served increased up to 10,000. That's for breakfast, lunch, and early dinner. The case study lists some of the quantities of food items that are handled at the kitchen per day, such as 150 kilo of rice, 120 kilo of coconut, and 30 kilo of coriander leaves during peak season. There are also efforts made to avoid food wastage. Leftover food, for example, is mixed with fodder and fed to cattle in the temple's goshala. And that is just one example of how faith-inspired actors, how they are involved in a quite large scale food logistics. So far, I've discussed how Jainism connects to food security. Jains have a long tradition of reflecting rationally on the best diet. They have food issues tied to a wider horizon of meaning, the ultimate goals in life. They have the experience both of long-term provision of food and large-scale emergency responses for food security. I would like to take the remaining time of that presentation to make a broader case for including religious communities like the Jains at the policy tables for food security. The background for this is that over the last years, I have participated in a project organized by the Center for Religion, Human Values and International Relations at Dublin City University. The result of that project was a report released in July 2023, which is aimed primarily at policymakers. The title of that report is Collective Action for Ending a Collective Problem, a multi-stakeholder project on global food security. In that report, we make recommendations on many issues, including the call to involve religious communities and leaders in consultation and decision-making processes on the topic of food security. Our starting point is that in order to achieve food security for all, political processes need to be complemented by multi-stakeholder forms of cooperation at many levels. Religious traditions speak very vocally about food justice, the need for hospitality, sharing, just distribution, avoidance of food waste, and the appreciation of the food that we have. Like the Jain community in Bangalore showed, religious communities stepped up during the COVID-19 crisis to ensure food security in their neighborhoods when governments were often still baffled what they should do. And a lesson has to be learned from this, namely that religious communities and their representatives should be included in the decision-making processes relating to food security. For our report, we list 6 practical reasons. First, faith communities bring values to the discussions on food security. I already mentioned this point. These communities mediate between the immediate need for physical survival and the ultimate concerns of human flourishing. And both are needed for achieving long-term food security. Religious perspectives bring to the debate about food security a strong focus on providing the basic necessities of life for all, such as the fundamental importance of hospitality and food giving. Religious traditions are oriented towards the ultimate goal, in the case of Jainism, the liberation of the soul from bondage. And by having their ultimate goal in the person's well-being beyond this world, they can uphold the value claim that this goal must not be subordinated to concerns for profit or the logic of the market. So religious perspectives thus offer a distinct order of priorities, which can bring a useful catalyst to wider public debate. Second, religious actors and the stories of religious traditions can often reach and engage people which cannot be reached by secular narratives and their peers. In particular, they can reach the marginalized and the underrepresented. Third, faith-inspired organizations operate on the local, regional, national, and global level. They are well placed to nurture friendships across institutional and national divides. Faith communities tend to have strong networks already, and on the local, but also on international level. And these networks can be activated in times of need, but they should also be taken into consideration in normal operations. Fourth, behavioral shifts will have to take place to improve food security under conditions of climate change, ecological degradation, shrinking resources, and a growing world population. Notably, we need a shift away from patterns of overconsumption, particularly when it comes to eating meat and consuming dairy among wealthier populations. So we also need a more deliberative relationship with nature, with land, and the interconnectedness of earth and human life. Faith communities can help promote the changes of lives that are needed for a just transition. The Jain community in particular has already been very active in campaigning for value-led dietary shifts within, but also beyond its own community. And I think a strength of the Jain approach is that it actually shows how doing what is right for others also benefits oneself, benefits the soul. So it's a win-win situation. With faith communities have long practical experience in alleviating hunger and malnourishment, not least in areas affected by instability and conflict. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many religious actors extended their existing initiatives to focus on food security. Faith-inspired organizations are supported in their efforts by the funds raised among their community, as well as highly motivated staff and volunteers. In some contexts, religious actors may be just especially trustworthy and altruistic by donors and recipients. This, I think, holds especially for the Jain community, which has a long-standing reputation as very reliable business partners. Sixth, and finally, faith communities are often exemplary role models for action and hope. Religious communities can draw their strength from a wider horizon of firm belief that even if things are not falling into place immediately, there is a better state that in the long term can be achieved. This hope is grounded in religious narratives, texts, rituals, and festivals that structure time and help to face the present and the future through the wisdom gained from the past. Hope, if restored to its fuller cultural meaning, can help to bridge the gap between the familiar and the unknown, between today and a future that is not yet visible and maybe not even yet imaginable. The value of such action, hope, I think, cannot be underestimated in our times of rapid transformation, where loss of identity and simply disorientation is such a big issue about how should we feed this big population. So what we need is that value of hope, not to be seen as something negative that religions give vainly, but as something that is a real strength in acting for making the world a better place. One concept I would like to highlight in particular is the concept of food sovereignty. The concept of food sovereignty recognizes the cultural dimension of food, that there is more to human consumption and production than simply filling an empty belly. Like the language that we speak, the food that we eat is part of our identity. Vegetarianism for Jains is not just about meeting nutritional needs. Rather, food choices depend on a combination of nutritional, cultural, ethical, and spiritual factors. This is something that should be remembered in discussions about dietary transitions, especially when we are presented with future scenarios about squid farms, food produced from insects, or artificial meat, and that means meat which is lab-grown from animal cells. Last year, I attended an interesting presentation by Arihanta from Cambridge University, who spoke about Hindu attitudes to artificial meat. And one position was basically that using animal cells as the basis for lab-grown food was disrespecting the animal, even if no animal had to die for that particular steak. So I don't know if there have been Jain statements on this issue, but I think it's a very interesting topic relating to the kind of trade-offs of different models of dietary shifts and how religious communities can make their voice heard in these debates. I will now come to the conclusion. In this presentation, I aim to show that Jainism has a lot to contribute to discussions of food security, both in terms of concepts and ideas such as ahimsa, mutual interdependence, connection of food consumption and spiritual flourishing of the soul, and in terms of practical experience, ranging from crisis management during COVID-19 to lobbying for dietary shifts. And I also tried to promote the concept of food sovereignty as an idea that might help to show the importance of cultural values in the promotion of food security. And that is one role that religious actors could play when bringing these debates to the policy table. So the goal of my presentation was to show how food security might be a useful lens for channeling much of the work that Jains are doing already to a particular topic that is very practice-oriented and something that is really a task for our generation to focus on. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Melanie. That was fascinating. I'm an economist, and I could see so many parallels with what you said. And also the fact that I loved you, not born in a Jain tradition, saying that Jains should be at the policy table. You know, I've been saying this so long, and I'm sure many others as well. But then when a Jain says it, people think that they are biased. But here, you know, you're not born in the Jain tradition, and you absolutely recognize this. So thank you so much for that.